Hey, I want to take a little time tonight to talk about a really nasty little fact, an unpleasant little fact, but a fact that we're all mostly aware of already. The fact that the United States is the mass shooting capital of the world. Now, we know this is true because Obama told us it was so. Now, all the fact checkers that, police the media and the government, they said, no, that's not right. But he said, oh, yes, it is, and here's this study I have to back it up. And since then, a lot of the anti-gunners, a lot of the leftist politicians, they use this same study to back up their claims that the United States is the mass shooting capital of the world. That there's something about our country, and they usually mean by something, they mean the presence of guns, that makes us just kill each other willy-nilly. And they use that study to back up that whole idea. Well, I want to take the time today to look at that study, and I want to look at another study on the same topic that came to very different conclusions, and let's compare the two studies. The first study, the one Obama loves, is by an Adam Lankford, I do believe his name is. He is a teacher and a professor at the University of Alabama, the very prestigious University of Alabama, or Alabama, as we would say in Alabama when I lived there. So that's where the one study comes from. And the other study is by John Lott. Now, John Lott is an author, he's a scholar, he is, I believe he's the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. So he's got some credentials. Both of these guys have some credentials. So let's look at their individual studies. Now, the Lankford study says that over a course of several years, he was able to identify 292 mass shootings, which seems kind of low to me, but that's what he found. And out of those 292 mass shootings, 90 of them were done in this country, the U.S. That means we were responsible for about 30% of all the mass shootings of the world. One country, 30% of the mass shootings. That's not good. That would make us the mass shooting capital of the world. Now, the Lott study came to a much different conclusion. They looked at even a shorter time period, and they were able to find almost 1,500. It was like 1,491 or something like that. They were able to find almost 1,500 mass shootings, and only 43 actually occurred in this country. Because, they use the FBI statistics, not their own statistics, or definition, I should say. So they said, well, 43 out of 1,500, that's less than 3%, that's not 30%. So how do you get such a huge discrepancy between two studies that looked at the same information? Well, the first thing you would have to do is look at their research materials. But, we can't really do that, because although John Lott has said, here's all my research materials, here's what I used as sources, here's what I found, here's how I researched it, here's how I set up the criteria, etc. He's provided all of that to the media and all of that to peers. And I've never seen any of them actually attack his information before. I just see them attacking him as a person. But let's move on to the other person and why we can't really compare the two methodologies. Because the Adam Lankford, or whatever his name is, won't release any of his data. He won't give it to anyone. When they ask, well, what sources did you use? He basically just says, the New York City Police Department records and newspapers from overseas. But then he won't provide any of the data or any of the information or any of the methodology or anything. He just clams up and will not give it to anyone to review. Which I think it's funny is the people that dislike Lott say, well, your stuff's not been peer-reviewed, even though it usually has been peer-reviewed, and he actually sued some people that said it hadn't been. They say it hasn't been peer-reviewed, even though they're wrong, and yet this other guy won't even turn over his information, and they're fine with that. So you can't compare them based on their methodologies, because the guy who says that we're the murder capital of the world won't release his information. And I'm sorry, if you're a scientist and you won't release your information or your methodology, then you're not a scientist and you have no credibility. But let's pretend that we are going to give the guy some credit. We're going to have to look at other reasons why these studies can be so different. And there's actually a really good reason why he came up with a much lower number. It's called cherry-picking. What he did is he decided, when I look at mass shootings overseas, I'm going to eliminate things that are widespread in those countries that don't really happen here to make it look like things are worse here. What he did is kind of like the equivalence of saying, in the U.S. you have a much greater chance of dying before you're 6 years old than in other countries. So in the U.S. we're like the infant mortality capital of the world. And then putting a little subnote in there, it says, if you exclude kids who died from cholera, or kids who starved to death, or kids who were, eaten by a hippo, anything like that doesn't really pertain to our country, that then we look really bad then, because, those kids in Africa or wherever are dying from cholera and things like that aren't counted on the list, or AIDS or whatever. A rock to the head, which I'm sure takes out a lot of kids. Believe me, I've got kids, I know. So if you leave out those things, well then, yeah, it looks like in America, it's a place where most kids don't ever reach their 6th birthday, but that's just not true. So what this guy did, when he looked at shootings overseas, he said, you know what I'm not going to count? I'm not going to count occurrences where bombs are also used. Because bombs are quite often used in mass shootings overseas. They're not really used very often here. Because, people don't bother with bombs. And I don't like bombs. I'm glad people here don't bother with bombs. He also said, hostage situations that resulted in mass shootings. Like someone took someone hostage, made a statement, and then ended up shooting people. Not going to count that. I don't know why they're not going to count that, but they're not going to count that. Because that happens a lot more overseas than it does here. So that's something that will eliminate a lot of their mass shootings. He also said anything that's related to genocide. Basically meaning if one guy walks into a restaurant and kills a bunch of people, if he's from a neighboring state or race or ethnicity, they'll be like, oh, that's genocidal because we know these two people are fighting now, and he did that because of their race, so it's part of the whole genocidal thing. So anything that's genocide, anything that's even related remotely to genocide, they didn't include. Also, the number one thing they decided to exclude, anything that's called terrorism. Because, in other countries, you got a much better chance of being killed in a terrorist act than you do here in this country. Because of the way we define terrorism. They're much looser, than we are. Here, the Pulse Nightclub Act, that would be an act of terrorism. But he was more than happy to count that on his study. Or people like him are more than happy to count that in their study. But overseas, they'd go, well, the guy who did it's a Muslim, and the people he shot were mostly not Muslim, so that's a terrorist act, and it doesn't count. In fact, some countries, one country in particular, I can't remember exactly which one it was, they went from when you included terrorism, they had 192 mass shootings. When you removed terrorism, they had 4. So it makes a big difference. So he chose terrorism, knowing that in this country where we're not all sitting duck targets, terrorism is not a big an issue. Because most people here aren't going to run into the Piggly Wiggly and start shooting for the sake of Allah or whatever, because they're going to get shot in the face. Especially if that Piggly Wiggly is in, Tennessee or Alabama or something. So it just doesn't happen as much here. Plus, we have better law enforcement. We don't have as much religious extremism here in this country. Our religion is old and it's mellowed out. Theirs is still really young and pissed off. So we don't have those problems here. So what they did is they just basically eliminated everything overseas that doesn't happen here. So that it doesn't affect our numbers at all. It just drops their numbers to next to nothing. Still far more people are getting killed per capita over there in mass killings. Period. Especially when you take guns out of the equation. But even when it's just mass shootings, we're still not the mass shooting capital of the world. They got no chance of saying we're the mass killing capital of the world. People are being killed in mass quantities in other countries, so much greater numbers, in so much greater numbers than they are here. This is a very safe place to live. So they can't make that argument, so they have to narrow it down to mass shootings, and then they have to give a very specific definition that excludes the number 1 causes, number 2 cause, number 3 cause, and number 4 cause of mass shootings in other countries that don't really have an effect on our numbers. So that first study is bunk. He crafted it specifically in a certain way to exclude things that happen in other countries that don't have an effect here. The second study by lot, it counts pretty much everything. It just says if it's a mass shooting, it's a mass shooting. I'm not going to go into mindset. So anytime someone or a couple of people walk into a certain area or drive or whatever and decide to shoot up a lot of people for whatever their mindset is, whether it's a church or whatever, it's a mass shooting. And over there, same thing. I don't care if they did it in the name of Allah. I don't care if they did it because someone was the wrong race. He doesn't care why they did it. They just did it, just like here, so it counts as a mass shooting. And when you do that, you see the United States ain't dangerous. It's no more dangerous than any other place. In fact, it's safer than the vast majority of places. So I just wanted to say this today because I wanted to point out that study that you people on the left keep claiming is your gospel, well, Obama actually commissioned a CDC study, which they don't usually talk about now, to verify that study. It came back saying, nope, sorry, you can't verify pretty much anything that gun laws do anything good. So he said, well, that'll go in the garbage, which is what he did. And the other study, the only people that attack it are like, we just don't like the way you did it. We don't like the fact that you're ignoring his criteria for overseas, and we don't like you. And like I say, some people, it's not been peer reviewed. Even though, like I said, he sued those people that said it hadn't been peer reviewed because it had been. And won, I do believe. So they got one they're attacking for not being peer reviewed, one that won't even release his information and is completely and easily debunked. And Lott, just to say what his sources were, he used the terrorism database that he accessed from one of the colleges. He used FBI reports, and he used media reports also from overseas. He just didn't eliminate the ones that said, well, there was religious reasons, or there was ethnic reasons, or there was, etc. He didn't just throw those newspaper clippings away like the other guy did, like the Lankford, or whatever his name is. So in the end, you can see one study is actually pretty inclusive and actually gives you a fair number, the Lott study. The other one is just a bunch of garbage that won't even tell you how he came to his conclusions and is so cherry-picked and selective that it gives you no conclusions even if he gave us our information. And that's the Lankford study. And surprise, surprise, the one that's anti-gun but totally anti-science is the one Obama, the anti-gunners, Bloomberg, etc. That's the one they love, and that's the one they quote. Facts be damned, because the other one doesn't support their conclusions. The fact that the United States is the murder capital, not the fucking murder capital of the world. Hey, I want to take some time today to talk about something that we already all know, and that is the fact. Hey, I want to take some time today to discuss a topic that we're all already aware of. Hey, I want to take a moment today to talk about a fact that we are already aware of. And that... Let's start this over. This is bad. A fact that most of us are already aware of, already. And that fact is that... Fuck! John Lott is the president of I believe it's called the National Crime Prevention Institute. Scholar. He's a writer. He's the president of the National Crime Prevention Association. The president of the National Crime Prevention Association, or something like that. I can't remember what it's called, but I'll write it down here, whatever it's called. Fuck, I'm going to start over and look up the fucking name of that goddamn organization. And the anti-gunners love to quote the Adam, what was his name? Fuck! Whew. Primal Scream helps. Makes it to where you can start over again without wanting to kill yourself. Or somebody. Study to back them up. Why can they get away with that if the studies, Fudge! Why did I say fudge? No, fuck.